On a busy street corner in Brooklyn, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of the city, there was a boy. Day after day, he sat in the same spot in front of the cafe, his small body huddled against the weathered brick wall. His eyes, two deep pools of sadness, shed endless tears that silently streamed down his pale cheeks. People rushed by, casting curious glances, but never stopping. The boy was like a ghost, present but invisible, his pain palpable yet ignored. His name was Tommy, though no one there knew it. Maria, the cafe owner, saw him every day. Who is this boy, she wondered, as she wiped down tables and looked out the window. Sometimes, she felt like approaching him, but her own life was a constant struggle. Keeping the cafe open was a daily effort, especially in that neighborhood that seemed to forget small business owners like her. There were debts, bills to pay, and a weight in her chest that she carried without sharing with anyone. One afternoon, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the air was too cold for the time of year. The boy was in his usual spot, legs pulled up and gaze distant. Maria paused for a second, watching him. Something inside her broke. "Hey, kid," she called from the cafe door, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone all day. The boy looked up, surprised that someone was addressing him. His gaze was a mix of fear and hope. "Are you hungry?" she continued, pointing to the plate of food in her hand. He hesitated for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust this woman or not. Then, slowly, he nodded and stood up. He walked over to her without saying a word, took the plate, and sat back down on the step. Maria watched from afar, not quite sure what to feel. As he ate, something in the way he held the food, as if it might disappear at any moment, tugged at Maria's heart. After that day, a small routine formed. Every day, Maria left a plate of food near the door. Sometimes he took it without saying anything. Other times, his eyes met hers, and for a brief second, something like a smile appeared. She never forced him to speak or come into the cafe, but she always eagerly awaited that moment. The cafe was quiet, almost always empty, but the presence of that boy, although distant, began to become the most important part of her days. One day, when business was slow and the sun was already setting behind the buildings, the boy appeared as usual. But this time, instead of taking the plate and moving away, he stood at the door. Can I help with something?" he asked, his voice weak and hesitant, as if it was the first time he had spoken in a long time. Maria, surprised, looked at him and smiled slightly. "Sure, kid. You can help me put away the chairs out here if you want," she said, trying not to show the emotion that overtook her at that moment. From that day on, the boy began to help Maria with small tasks. He took out the trash, swept the floor, and in return, received not only the food he so desperately needed, but also companionship he didn't know he wanted. The cafe, once so empty and sad, began to come to life again. Not because of full tables, but because of the presence of two lonely hearts that, without realizing it, began to fill each other's void. On a cold night, after closing the cafe, Maria and the boy sat in the porch chairs. "You never told me your name," she said, trying to break the silence. "My name is Leo," he replied, looking at the ground as if saying his own name was painful. "And your family, Leo? Are they around here?" Maria asked cautiously. Leo was quiet for a moment, his eyes filling with tears he could no longer control. "I don't know where they are. They were taken. What's the word I heard people say? They were deported. But I know they'll come back. My mom promised me. I just need to wait here," he said, his voice broken by the pain he had been holding for so long. Maria fell silent, not knowing how to console this boy who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his fragile shoulders. She reached out, lightly touching his shoulder. "I know what it's like to wait for someone who might never come back," she said, her voice choked, remembering her own losses. Leo looked at her, surprised. For the first time, he saw that he wasn't as alone as he had imagined. The days continued, with Leo increasingly present at the cafe, helping Maria keep the place running. But the pain in his eyes never completely disappeared. He still waited, still believed his parents would return. With each passing day, Leo's steps became lighter, less hesitant. He was no longer just the boy who cried silently in front of Maria's cafe. Now, he moved with purpose, carrying small bags of bread or vegetables, doing what he could to repay the little he received. His face remained marked by sadness, but there was something more there, a kind of silent hope that grew without him realizing it. One afternoon, returning from the market, Leo entered the cafe, where Maria was cleaning the empty tables. The tinkling of the door as it opened made her look up, offering a warm smile that seemed to ease the burden the boy carried. "I brought the tomatoes you asked for," he said, placing the bags on the counter. Maria smiled again, but this time with a touch of tenderness. "Thank you, dear. You're a big help, you know," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron and walking over to him. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Leo lowered his gaze, embarrassed, fiddling with his own fingers as if he didn't know how to handle the compliment. It was a new feeling for him. "I'm not much," he muttered. Maria stopped beside him, leaning down a bit to see his face. "Don't say that. Everyone needs someone at some point. And you've been that someone for me," she said, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed new even to herself. Leo bit his lip, struggling to hold back tears. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken kind words to him. Somehow, those simple words from Maria were like a balm that began to heal old wounds, even if slowly. In the days that followed, Leo became part of the cafe's routine. He arrived early and swept the sidewalk, put the chairs outside, cleaned the tables. The cafe wasn't a public success, but in that small space, Maria and Leo's lives began to take on colors that had previously been swallowed by the gray monotony of sadness. Time passed, and Maria subtly insisted that Leo come closer. He now ate at the cafe, and she began to open up about her own difficulties. She told him how the cafe was her only source of income, how there were days when she could barely pay the bills. But never, at any moment, did she complain or fail to smile when she saw Leo coming through the door. One night, as they were locking up the cafe, Leo stopped at the door, looking at Maria in a way she hadn't seen before. "Maria?" he began hesitantly. "You do so much for me, as if I were your son." She looked at him, surprised, but with a growing warmth in her chest. "Maybe because I've always wanted a son like you," she said softly, moving closer and placing her hand on Leo's face. He blinked, trying to hold back the tears that were welling up in his eyes. But this time, the tears weren't of sadness. They were something new, something he couldn't name, but felt deeply. "Thank you, Maria," he said in a trembling whisper, before throwing himself into her arms, as if he had finally found the place where he belonged. And there, in Maria's embrace, the boy found, for the first time, a piece of peace. Maria spent days and nights thinking about the boy. Leo had become more than just a constant presence in the cafe. She saw the deep sadness in his eyes, the weight of a life so young, marked by a pain he couldn't express in words. He still didn't talk much, but the silent gestures of trust he offered her spoke for themselves. She knew he needed more, something that maybe she could give. One night, while closing the cafe, Leo was sitting in one of the chairs outside, his eyes fixed on the sky, as if looking for some answer among the stars. Maria came out, her apron still tied around her waist, and sat down beside him. The silence between them was comfortable, but worry grew inside her, tightening her chest. "Leo," she began hesitantly. He turned his face towards her but said nothing, just watched her, waiting. "I've been thinking you could live with me, you know? It doesn't have to be anything big, just you'd have a place, a room, hot food every day. What do you think?" Leo looked at her, his eyes shining in the dim light of the street lamps. For a moment, Maria saw a spark of something, maybe desire, maybe hope. But then, he lowered his head, and the answer came, breaking her heart. "I can't," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My parents will come back. I know they will." Maria felt a sharp pain pierce her chest, as if Leo's words were sharp knives. She wanted to hug him, tell him that the world doesn't work that way, that sometimes people don't come back. But how could she? How could she destroy the only thing keeping this boy going? She couldn't be that cruel. "I understand, dear," she said softly, though her heart was breaking inside. But while you wait, please, let me take care of you, okay? I won't ask for anything in return. Just let me help. Leo looked at her, his eyes watery. He wanted to accept. Maria knew that. But the loyalty he had to his parents, the desperate hope he nurtured, prevented him from taking that step. He nodded slightly, but still couldn't find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions he felt. Have you ever lost someone you love? Leo suddenly asked, his voice small but filled with a pain that Maria knew well. She took a deep breath, her gaze getting lost on the horizon, remembering her own past, the people she had loved and lost. Yes, Leo, I have, she said, her voice trembling. And I know how much it hurts. I know how hard it is to accept that they might not come back. But I also know that the pain, it becomes easier to bear when you have someone by your side. Leo kept looking at the ground, absorbing Maria's words, but unable to fully believe them. He still clung to the idea that his parents would return one day, that everything would go back to the way it was before. But Maria's kindness was starting to open a crack in the walls he had built around his heart. Night had fallen over the city with sudden violence, a storm that seemed to want to sweep everything in its path. The streets, normally quiet, were now dominated by gusts of wind and a torrential rain that seemed to have no end. Maria was restless, looking out the window of the cafe, which had closed earlier due to the bad weather. Leo had gone out to get some vegetables that were missing for the special dinner she was planning, trying to bring a little joy to that gray day. But he should have been back hours ago. The clock marked another hour past, and there was no sign of Leo. Maria's heart was racing, fear growing with every minute he remained outside. She knew she couldn't just wait. Putting on her heaviest coat and grabbing a flashlight, she went out into the storm, determined to find the boy who had become like a son to her. The streets were deserted. The relentless rain made visibility difficult, but Maria didn't give up. She called out for Leo, her voice almost drowned out by the sound of wind and rain. After almost an hour of frantic searching, she found him. Leo was huddled in an alley, sheltered by a small overhang of an old building. He was soaked, shivering from the cold, his lips purple, his skin pale. "Leo!" Maria shouted, running to him, the flashlight illuminating his frightened face. "My God, you're freezing." She wrapped him in her coat, lifting him in her arms with effort. He was light, too light, a clear sign that the street had taken more from him than just the joy of a normal childhood. With difficulty, she took him back home, where the fireplace was already lit, waiting for them. All night long, Maria took care of Leo. She changed his wet clothes, covered him with warm blankets, and prepared tea to try to warm him up. His fever was worrying, and several times during the night, he became delirious, calling for his parents in a sad whisper that broke Maria's heart. When dawn came, bringing a clear sky and the promise of a better day, Leo was calmer, the fever finally subsiding. Maria was by his side, holding his hand, watching him as he slept. When he woke up, his eyes met hers, and there was a clarity in them that wasn't there before. "Maria?" he began hesitantly, his voice still weak. I don't think they're coming back, are they? My parents." Maria felt a tear roll down her cheek, but she smiled at him, a mixture of sadness and relief in her gaze. "Maybe not, my dear, but you're not alone. You'll never be as long as I'm here." Leo looked at her, his eyes still full of an old pain, but now there was also a glimmer of something new. Maybe acceptance. Maybe hope. "Thank you, Maria, for everything." She squeezed his hand, the two sharing a moment of silent understanding. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside Leo was just beginning to calm. Together, they would face whatever came next, no longer as strangers, but as a family forged by circumstances and solidified by their unwavering compassion for one another. The fever had finally subsided, but the transformation it brought in Leo was palpable. He woke up on a cold autumn morning, his eyes still heavy, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't the weight of sadness that dominated him. By his bed, Maria was already there with a steaming cup of tea, her gaze tired from nights spent caring for him. "How are you feeling, my love?" Maria asked, her voice soft but with a note of concern. Leo looked at her, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't name. The woman who had found him on the street, huddled and weak, was now the only person in the world who seemed to matter. He had never called anyone mom since his parents disappeared, and the word felt heavy on his tongue, but at the same time, it seemed like the only right thing to say. Mom. His voice came out almost in a whisper, hesitant, as if testing the sound of that word on his lips. Maria froze. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. The cup of tea trembled in her hands. It was as if all the struggles, losses, and nights of worry were worth it in that moment. She leaned close to him, gently touching his forehead with her trembling hand. "What did you say?" She could hardly believe it. "Mom," he repeated, this time more firmly, looking at her with a mixture of fear and hope. "Can I call you that?" She couldn't speak. The tears were falling freely now, and she just pulled him into a tight hug, not caring about his fragility. "You're already my son," she murmured into his hair, her heart bursting with an emotion she didn't even know she was capable of feeling again. From that moment on, something changed between them. Leo started coming to the cafe not just as a favor to Maria, but with the same dedication as someone who cared for something they loved. He woke up early every day, helping to prepare breakfast for the few remaining customers, cleaning tables, and arranging chairs on the sidewalk. The small cafe, once a lonely burden for Maria, now seemed to gain new life with his presence. "Could you go get more bread for breakfast, son?" Maria asked one morning, with the naturalness that only time brings. Leo smiled. That word, son, sounded sweet to his ears, filling the void that for so long he thought would never be filled. "Sure, Mom, I'll be right back," he said, running to get the money and leaving with the lightness of someone who now belonged somewhere. Days passed, and little by little, the cafe began to prosper again. There wasn't much profit, true, but the tables were always occupied, and the atmosphere was welcoming. The old customers, who had known Maria for years, noticed the change. "Who's this boy who's always around here?" asked a regular customer, an elderly gentleman who always came for coffee and to read the newspaper. Maria smiled, her gaze seeking Leo, who was serving a table in the back, concentrated on his work. "He's my son," she replied, with a firmness that allowed no further questions. The man smiled in response, and the conversation died there, as if everything made sense. But even with this new life, the shadow of the past still loomed over them. Leo still dreamed of his parents from time to time, a distant echo of the pain that hadn't completely left him. One night, while washing dishes beside Maria, he broke the silence with a question she knew would eventually come. "Do you think my parents might still come back?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the plate he was scrubbing. There was a vulnerability in his voice, a mixture of hope and resignation. Maria stopped what she was doing, dried her hands, and turned to him, leaning against the sink. "I don't know, Leo," she said carefully. "But what I do know is that if they come back, they'll find a strong boy who faced things no one your age should face. And that, while they're not here, you have a home here." Leo remained silent for a moment, absorbing those words. He didn't respond, but something in his gaze softened, as if part of that anguish was beginning to dissipate. They continued washing the dishes, side by side, in comfortable silence. The sound of running water and dishes clinking against each other filled the small kitchen space. The battles they had faced were still fresh in their memories, but now, for the first time, there was a sense that, together, they could overcome anything. It was the beginning of a new bond, unbreakable and forged in pain, but sustained by love that grew amidst adversity. The sunny days brought new life to Maria's cafe, but the real change was in Leo's small heart, which now smiled more than it cried. The mornings were filled with the smell of fresh coffee and newly baked bread, while the routine of opening the doors of the establishment became more than just work. It was a ritual of life, a way to reconnect with what really mattered. Leo, with his thin arms, helped Maria arrange the chairs and tables outside. The sunlight reflected on his face, now less marked by the tears of the past. His smile, although shy, was becoming more frequent. "You know, Mom," he said, with a hint of hesitation. It was the first time he had used the word so naturally. I think I'm going to start going to school, like you told me, a new cycle, and I think I'll never forget my parents. Maria stopped cleaning the glass door for a moment, absorbing what Leo had just said. Her heart tightened, but at the same time, she felt a wave of relief. She approached him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I know, Leo," she replied, her voice low but full of feeling. "And that's okay. They will always be a part of you, of who you are. But while you're here, by my side, know that you have someone who loves you." Leo looked at Maria, his eyes full of new understanding. It was as if something had changed inside him, a painful but necessary acceptance. He smiled, a small and shy smile, but genuine. "I know. I feel that now." The cafe, once empty and silent, was now full of voices and laughter. Customers began to notice the difference, not just in the tidy tables and good service, but in the energy that now filled the place. It was as if the place had come back to life, and Maria, along with Leo, made sure to treat everyone who walked through the door as a friend, someone who was part of this new chapter. On a busy afternoon, while serving a table, Maria looked at Leo across the room, serving a group of customers. He was focused, almost professional in his approach. When he finished serving, the smile on his lips was visible, a lightness that seemed impossible not long ago. He looked back at Maria and, for a brief second, their eyes met. It was like a silent exchange of gratitude, a promise that, despite all the storms they had faced, they were together on this new journey. After closing the cafe that night, Leo and Maria sat at the table, eating in silence, fatigue taking over their bodies. But there was a serenity, a comfort in each other's presence that made everything more bearable. "Mom, do you think we're okay now?" Leo asked, breaking the silence. Maria looked at him, surprised by the question. She put down her utensils and smiled, tired but full of love. "I don't know if we're okay, Leo," she answered honestly. "But we're much better than before." Leo nodded, understanding. The okay he had been looking for so long might never be complete. But he was learning that sometimes better didn't mean perfect, it meant being with someone who cared. That night, as he lay down, Leo looked out the window of his room. The moon illuminated the sky in a soft and welcoming way, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of an absence. Instead, he felt complete. Not because his pain had disappeared, but because he had found something greater, a love built in the midst of suffering, a family that, even without blood ties, was stronger than he could have imagined. "Good night, Mom," he murmured before closing his eyes, feeling that, despite all the losses, he had gained more than he could have dreamed.